are the lead European trade association looking to deploy carbon capture and storage at commercial scale. We have over 120 members right across the value chain, so from capture technology companies, from CO2 storage and transport members, from industries that are looking to deploy carbon capture and storage, as well as service industries, so finance, insurance, industries as well. We have offices in both London and Europe, and members who work both in the UK, EU and globally. So why are we here today? We're talking about the opportunity of carbon capture and storage in the UK, and the UK government has a legally binding target of reaching net zero, and in all the scenarios from the independent bodies, from the CCC, from the IEA, carbon capture and storage is an essential component of reaching that target. And so if we are to decarbonise our energy system, if we did decarbonise our heavy industries in the UK, we will need to deploy carbon capture at scale. The UK government has also set us quite ambitious targets for doing that. We need to capture between 20 and 30 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2030. By deploying 4 industrial clusters across the UK, and that will then double to 50 to 60 million tonnes of CO2 per year by 2035. So it's a huge challenge, and how do we get there, and what can we, how do we build this multi-billion-pound industry in a few years, and what are the opportunities and challenges of us getting there? I think some of the opportunities, it's worth flagging up front, are enormous for the UK. The CCSA estimate that we could create 70,000 new jobs. We will also retain up to around 77,000 jobs in UK industries around our major industrial areas around the UK. By enabling them to decarbonise, we can keep those people in jobs there. We can also attract around £30 billion worth of private sector investment into the UK by 2030 by building these clusters and building this carbon capture technology. We also have 1/3 of Europe's potential geological CO2 storage in Europe. And that's the equivalent to all the other EU states combined. So we have huge potential. We have more CO2 storage potential than we would need for our domestic emissions. And so there's an opportunity there to export our skills and storage services there to EU emitters as well. And we can build on our existing skills and manufacturing that we have. We have expertise in the offshore, we have expertise in manufacturing in the UK, and we could build a world-class supply chain to service this industry and then export that elsewhere. So today I'm joined by a panel of expert speakers from across that value chain, and they're each going to give you 5 minutes of an overview of what they're working in and how they play a part of that. We will then have a discussion, and please do use this QR code to submit questions to the Slido, and there'll be an opportunity for questions. I'll keep looking at the questions as they come in, so we'll go to audience for questions. So I would now like to introduce my first speaker. This is Jonathan Briggs, who is Director of Development and Delivery at VPI, and responsible for over £500 million worth of project investment at VPI, including 3 projects currently under construction in the UK and Ireland. So over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Olivia. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine. It's kind of a weird setting doing this through headphones, etc. Yeah. But so Innovation Zero and looking at what it means to get to net zero. I think Olivia teed up the whole challenge around what we're trying to achieve in CCS and recognizing that we don't get to net zero without CCS, period. And some of the numbers that Olivia just outlined in terms of getting to 2030, we're aiming as the UK to get to 20 to 30 million tonnes CO2 into the ground. And then by 2035, 50 to 60, recognizing that as of today, we are at 0. So we have a massive challenge ahead of us, and we absolutely need CCS in order to innovate around it. That's the key to, I think, a lot of the ideas that you see in this conference. So a huge challenge ahead of us, and I would say straight away, actually, we're off track. So we have ambition, we have some progress, we have a track one. We need to believe that we're actually looking beyond that, because to meet some of these targets and make sure that we're meeting them in the timeline that will make a difference, we need to make sure that we keep that momentum. Absolutely key, and it's one of the sort of central messages for government, but also as projects. We also need to make sure that we also are ready when the time comes. I think I represent a company that's developing a project in the Humber. The Humber is the largest industrial cluster. If we're going to decarbonise as the UK, we need to decarbonise the entire industrial economy. And CCS is obviously a key technology for that, again, on which we'll be developing the infrastructure that others will be able to innovate around it. So we're developing a project which is almost a sweet spot within the sweet spot. So Humber Zero is a capture project at a large combined heat and power plant around a refining complex where we have, again, the UK's largest industrial cluster. So actually having a lot of emissions is a helpful place to start. From an anchor perspective, in other words, the projects that will help the storage projects develop, we have materiality. We can actually, Humber Zero is almost 20% in and of itself of what the government is trying to achieve by 2030. And we also, again, the intensity of emissions actually lends itself to providing a pathway, or an economic pathway, to decarbonisation. I think the other thing to remember as each of us talk is the idea that these projects need to really, timing is everything. We need to be ready to go, and certainly from a Humber Zero perspective, we are ready to go. We've completed FEED, we have technology vendors lined up, we have everything that we need to do ready, so that when there is the investment signals from government, we're ready to actually deploy. And that's actually the key to keep everyone involved in this industry, to keeping that momentum moving forward. And the last thing I'd say is an idea of CCS is obviously often portrayed as a cost to society, and the combination of cost and benefit is sometimes lost, I think. There's a massive benefit to the UK. On a final note, Olivia outlined some of the benefits, but in terms of the potential opportunity as a hub for storage, not every country has that ability to actually say that. We have unique assets. And also in terms of investment, jobs, in the areas that actually need it. So I think I would end on that note in terms of the investment potential and the opportunity for the UK.
Thank you, and we'll come back with questions on the project and track 2. But our next speaker is John Hartley, who is Chief Executive Officer of Levidian, and we're going to hear a bit about something that we don't always talk about on these panels. We're going to talk about utilisation. So John represents a British climate tech business that captures carbon from methane and produces valuable clean hydrogen and graphene. So over to you. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, and hi everybody. So there are two main messages from me today. One is that the U in CCUS, so carbon capture, utilisation and storage, the U is absolutely key. And the second main message is this technology is already in market today. These are solutions which are already happening. So I'm an optimist and see really good momentum already started. Let me just explain a bit about what we do, and then I'll elaborate on those 2 points. So Levidian are a UK climate tech company. We are a pre-combustion carbon capture unit. So you bring the methane in, apply microwave energy, and you split it into carbon, which we lock away in the form of graphene and hydrogen. And that first point I made was utilisation is critical. So our graphene goes into concrete and cement to make it last longer, battery cells to make them perform better, tyres to make them more durable. That has a firstly a secondary carbon benefit. So not only are you capturing the carbon, but you're then decarbonising, for example, concrete and cement. Now, just those materials are 8% of all global emissions to make concrete and cement material. If you decarbonise them, you get this very good secondary benefit. The second message is utilisation improves the case for change, so the business case because it creates value. Longer lasting tyres are worth more, high performing batteries are worth more, and so carbon, rather than always being something that we have to dispose of, can be turned into really valuable material. So that utilisation piece is one message. The second one on readiness is also critical. So just in the last 12 months, our technology is being deployed to landfill sites which have waste methane, water treatment facility up in Manchester that United Utilities run, oil and gas processing facilities. This is technology which is there today and already working. Now, if I look at the whole CCUS ecosystem, I think we need all the solutions that you'll hear about today. So you need the very large CCS capture solutions, and you need more on-site modular solutions like the one that we offer. So we won't solve every problem, but by getting value from that carbon, by utilising it, I think the case for change doesn't need to wait for government incentives. Businesses are already acting on this, and it has a really compelling case for change. So happy to elaborate more when we get into questions later on how that works, but I think we're already making progress. And on the subject of the UK as a leader, graphene, which is the way that we capture our carbon, was discovered here. We're really leading the charge on building the tech, exporting it, and creating jobs. So I'm an optimist in the carbon capture space, and hopefully that gives you a sense of what it is that we do. Thanks.
Thank you, John. And just a reminder to please do, you can start submitting questions now if you want to, and I'll have a look at those on the Slido. I'll now introduce our third speaker, Richard Gwilliam, who is UK BECCS, that's bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, so a greenhouse gas removal technology, BECCS program manager at Drax. And he's responsible for managing the conversion of the UK's largest power station to the world's largest carbon removals project. So over to you, please, Richard.
Thanks, Olivia. What a peculiar experience. It's probably the most underwhelming silent discussion anyone's ever been to, so apologies for that. We'll do our best to make it entertaining and engaging. But as you rightly said, Olivia, I work for Drax. I'm going to be talking about the work that we're doing up in North Yorkshire, the pioneering work that we're doing to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Drax is a really interesting asset that we have in the UK. It's the largest power station that's connected to the UK electricity grid. First unit was commissioned 50 years ago this year, so it's been providing affordable electricity for the UK for a very long time. But the story of Drax is actually a story of evolution and change, because whilst it started off life as a large coal-fired power station, we've converted it so it now runs exclusively on sustainably sourced biomass. That single biggest change at Drax in North Yorkshire actually allowed the UK's electricity grid to decarbonise quicker than any other electricity grid in Europe. So we've already been part of the energy transition journey, but the process that we're going through now, the work that Olivia just described that I'm leading on, is how do we capture the CO2, which is a byproduct of biomass combustion? How do we take CO2 out of the flue gas, capture it, put it in a pipe and store it deep underground, locking it away permanently? We have planning consent. We have a development consent order in place from the start of this year that gives us permission to convert 2 of the 4 units. That will allow us to capture 8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. To put that into context, it's equivalent of taking 3 million cars off the road or stopping all departing flights from Heathrow. This is sort of, dial shifting technology that we're doing already in the UK and is ready to be deployed. And just to put into context why this is really important, so a couple of weeks ago, colleagues may remember that Secretary of State was heralding the UK's achievements around Carbon Budget 3. We have exceeded our carbon budgets by 15% was the big headline. At that point, and during the last 5 years, this country was emitting, on average, 391 million tonnes of carbon dioxide per year. Now let's be clear, that's a considerable reduction since 1990, which is when the targets are often set from. It's about a 40% reduction since 1990. In 9 years, we will get to carbon budget 6. That's the last budget that the government set out a methodical approach to achieving on the path to net zero. To meet carbon budget 6, in the same way that we just met carbon budget 3, we need to reduce our annual emissions in this country to 163 million tonnes. That's a 60% reduction in the amount of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere every year. That is, we talk about the step change from 1990 to now being 40%. That is a monumental effort that's needed just to be on the pathway to get to net zero. And let's remember, the net zero figure is 0. So with it's clear that we're going to need novel forms of technology to help make that happen, and with bioenergy at BECCS at Drax, we're able to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and provide a substantial contribution to those targets.
Thank you, Richard. So we've now heard from 3 technologies, and I'm going to come to our last speaker, Kirstie Simpson, who is Dean and Associate Professor at the University of Chester, who is going to talk about the skills challenge, because obviously we can talk about the scale of ambition and what we need to do, but if we don't have the people to do this, then it's not going to get done. So, Kirstie.
Thanks, Olivia. Really good to see you all today. You can hear me?
We can.
Okay, yeah.
Yep.
So I'd like to provide you with 4 key takeaways today. The first one is that the skills challenge that Olivia's rightly pointed out is real. We will need some innovative R&D. We will need innovative people to facilitate the technologies that colleagues have already described and how that will scale and scope in the future. That includes skilling our current workforce, so upskill, reskill, as well as skilling those individuals who don't even know and understand what job it is that they want to do in the future yet. So how do we influence those young people? Second key takeaway is that skills challenge starts from a position of inequity. Not everybody has the same opportunity. My third takeaway is the importance of place-based action, and we'll maybe pick that up a little bit as we go through the questions. And that actually the time for innovative action is right now. Well, actually it was probably about 5 years ago, but we are where we are. So we need to take that forward quickly. So how do we know the challenge is real? We know the challenge is real because there's a wealth of information, there's a wealth of data, there's a wealth of research out there now that tells us that we have a significant skills gap. We've undertaken research with HyNet, with Net Zero Northwest and through IDRIC, and we know those challenges are local, sub-regional, regional and national. So the scale of that challenge is different depending on which piece of research that you read, but we know, and that gap, that challenge is now well established. So the opportunity is there, and from my perspective the challenge is on. So what about this position of inequity? So why do we bother? What is the point of having a diverse workforce? And that's a rhetorical question, I guess, because I can't hear what you tell me what the answer is. However, it's not just the right thing to do, it's a really good thing to do. Research again tells us that decisions made and executed by a diverse workforce means that you can achieve up to 60% better results. So there's not only a people reason to do this, there's a financial and a commercial reason to do this as well. But we don't do it, or we don't do it as much as we might do. So that's a question. STEM-based subjects, particularly for young people, we need more young people to want to be involved in some of this work, not just at the high-skilled end, but at the construction end too. So we know that young women particularly take STEM subjects at A-level and they outperform their male counterparts. But those young women do not then, in their great numbers, then go into these technologies, into these areas of work. So what's happening there? There's something that's not quite working. In 2022, for the first time, girls overtook boys in A-level. So 50.1% of females got A star or A at A-level. That has not then translated into career opportunity. So the current STEM workforce, which is about 2.8 million people, only 26% of that workforce is female. Current construction workforce, less than 16%. So, where are the great examples? And I'll just let that hang in the air for a second. But some organisations like IDRIC, for example, are doing work. You cannot be what you cannot see. We need more people who are more visible in some of these positions to encourage young people to want to be involved. So my third key takeaway was around place-based action, and we'll probably talk a little bit more about that shortly. But there's a really key construction period between 2025 and 2030. We're up to 80 projects nationally, not just CCUS projects, but across the range of technologies that will be at or moving towards final investment decision, and we need more people to be more involved in that. How do we enable young people at a local level to get involved in those skills and those activities? So my fourth one is about innovative action. We need to do things differently. There's an old adage, if you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got. So what can we do? We need to work collaboratively. We need industry and education to work together to enable young people to see that pathway from school through college, maybe to university, but not necessarily, and then into these excellent technologies, because we will not get to, as we've already pointed out, we won't get to that net zero without people. We have to have people, more people, involved in order to facilitate that change.
Thank you, Kirstie. So I'll now ask the panel a few questions, but please do, I've got some coming in, and keep doing, and I'll keep going to them. It's a shame I can't actually come to you to speak, but I'll be reading them off. So I think if we start off, Jonathan, it would be useful if we sort of zone into the Humber region, where you are working. But can you tell us a little bit about what makes Humber Zero and the CCUS hub, they're innovative, and how could this be used as a platform around the UK? And then Kirstie, I'll then come to you about the skills and what type of skills on a place-based approach there are being put in place.
So what makes Humber Zero innovative in the sense of something that's different? I mean, first thing to say, actually, there's a lot that isn't innovative about CCS or CCUS. The technology has been around for decades, and really what we're trying to do is the innovative part actually is doing it at scale. And so the numbers that I was talking about before demand that projects are put forward at scale. And so one of the things that we're doing is we have, as I mentioned, a 1200 megawatt combined heat and power plant. It's integrated in a quarter to a third of the UK's refining capacity. That refining complex actually provides some of the goods, some of the products that we're going to need for the next decades to come. Sustainable aviation fuels and batteries for electric vehicles from graphite coke. So the innovative part is the scale, and we have one of the largest capture projects that we're proposing as a Track 2 project, and then also being part of this project consortium with Phillips 66, who are actually providing some of the products that are going to be required for this next period.
And I mean, we have a question that's come in. So you are part of the Track 2 process here. And there's a question here around the cluster process that the government has put into place engenders competition. How can we make it more collaborative?
Well, that's a great question. So a lot of what we're trying to do is first of a kind. So we're trying to actually, share some of the learnings as much as we can in terms of how we make decisions around technology choices, for example. To share sort of some of the, daily considerations around how are we actually going to operate these assets. So, for example, VPI run 5 operating power plants around the UK. If we're going to decarbonise, these plants are going to have to run very differently. They're going to start up, shut down, with capture facilities around them. So there's a whole raft of learnings that actually we're going to need to share, and that there are ways in which we're trying to do that, but but still respecting the fact that we actually have essentially a competitive world that we live in.
Yeah, and I think, there are lots of discussions around this, and that we know that we need to deploy all the projects in the clusters to meet our ambitions in the UK, and therefore, obviously we need competition to drive down cost, but collaboration is really important to let us move forward there. Kirstie, I just wanted to bring you in terms of, so Jonathan's talked about the scale at Humber. Can you tell us a little bit and bring in some of your place-based approach in terms of how the industry might engage more meaningfully with young people and their communities, and also what has been done as good practice?
Yeah, thank you. So, as Jonathan's rightly identified, there is the innovation in this activity is in the scale, not necessarily in the technology itself. So if you think about that in relation to the jobs that will be required, in our IDRIC study we identified across the range of technologies around £250 billion of capex over the course of the decarbonisation. That equates to around 360,000 jobs per year over that same course of time. We haven't got that many individuals in that pipeline right now. So it's not just the activity in terms of the decarbonisation that is operating at scale, it is also the education supply chain that will have to operate at scale. So how do we encourage, how do we influence, how do we inspire young people to want to be involved in this activity, particularly those young people, for example, in the HyNet geography, who may live in Ellesmere Port. They have the whole of HyNet on their doorstep. That's where they live. But there is a high school there where young people perform below the national average in English and maths. Their long-term educational outlook is not good. So how can we inspire those young people to create change? Well, one thing we have to do is enable them to understand what it is that is going on around them. How do we make that accessible to them? How do we enable them to see that and understand that in a way that they can understand? So you may well be Instagram users, you may well be Snapchat users. I am not. But that's the way that young people communicate. So how can we enable them to see that there is an opportunity there? And not just one or two young people, but at scale. That, I think, is, again, the challenge. There's some really great work going on up in the Humber with Catch. And I don't know if you might want to talk a little bit more about that. But it's a really great way of bringing young people, industry, and learning, not just education, but learning together in a really clear pathway to provide young people with a clear line of sight from where they are now to where they could be in terms of that job role. And I think a lot of young people now, certainly those young people in Ellesmere Port, find that very difficult because they cannot see a way out of the multiple levels of deprivation that they find themselves in. But they are right on the doorstep, and they could be engaged.
Jonathan, do you just want to say a little bit about Catch and how it's funded?
Catch is actually a great example. So a local facility in the Humber area that's essentially turning out 100 trained apprentices a year. So as part of all the decarbonisation work and the companies associated with it, there is a program to basically take 100 to 1,000, specifically around how to, basically, carry out all of the projects and deploy the projects that will make decarbonisation possible.
Great, and it's a great model, I think, that can be rolled out at scale. Richard, I wanted to come to you. You talked about the scale of Drax and the importance of that project in the UK's decarbonisation climate target. Could you tell us? I think it would be useful, I think, to say a little bit about how the industry has changed over the last 15 years and how you are managing those timescales and deadlines with a large project. And there is also a question that has come in, which I'll put to you, that says, with capacity constraints on grid connections, how will the UK respond to increased electrification and renewable demand, including innovative approaches?
I'll try to remember all of those. But answering them one at a time, you referenced very kindly 15 years because I realised that it is very nearly 15 years since I started trying to promote carbon capture and storage projects. I didn't have quite so much grey hair back then. In fact, Jonathan and I were comparing who's aged the most since this all kicked off. But it's a really interesting story because we have been talking about CCS in the UK, CCUS in the UK, for quite a long time. You know, I think there's Ed Miliband speaking tomorrow. He was almost the grandfather of CCS when he launched the Kingsnorth project to capture CO2 from a coal-fired power station and store it in the southern North Sea. I was involved in the White Rose project and a precursor activity to that was abruptly stopped under the Osborne-Cameron government. What's really interesting, Olivia, I think what's really changed for me is two things. One is demand. So I worked for National Grid previously. I was looking at building a pipeline through the Humber region, working again with colleagues like Jonathan. At the time, we had to go through something called the third-party access regulations, whereby we had to write to all the emitters in the region and say who wants to be part of a CCS network. The response was zero. Like, no one thought there was value in capturing CO2 or longevity in it. And this is going back to sort of 2012, 13, 14. Fast forward to something you just talked about, Olivia, Track 1 and the CCUS competition. I think all of the storage projects were completely overwhelmed by demand for this technology. And I think that's principally driven not just by the good work government done to bring forward business models, but a fundamental recognition that we have to do this now. And, you know, back then, there were some really strong policy drivers, but frankly, I don't think the political will was there. This time around, it's taken a while to bring the policy up to the same standard. It's much better now, actually. But the political will to deliver these projects is in abundance. And I think, you know, the scale of this event and the topics we're talking about is reflective of to how important the pathway to net zero has become. The other thing that's changed, if I can quickly, is innovation. So back then it was always about CO2 was there to abate emissions, to stop CO2 going out of the atmosphere. Now it's being used for the technology we've been talking about, BECCS, to remove CO2 out of the atmosphere. So, you know, whether you do a DAC project, direct air capture, whether you use a BECCS project, you're using, you know, novel modern technology to take designed for CCS to take CO2 out of the atmosphere and help mitigate the worst of the climate impacts. In terms of grid capacity, that's a great question, and should be well educated to answer that, having just preluded this by saying I used to work at Grid. I think that is an enduring question that the whole industry, and including Grid and including Ofgem, are grappling with at the moment. So obviously I think everyone will be aware that the sort of the system operator arm of National Grid, which used to sit within its sort of regulated business, will later this year actually transfer over to government. So the organisation responsible for allocating slots to the grid has been centralised, so it's taken away from private industry and goes to government. And to their credit, they've been engaged around the region. Jonathan and I participated in a discussion with them in the Humber. They recognise their first priority is how do we clear, quote, the zombie projects out of the queue. There has for a very long time been a lot of people, organisations, banking prospective grid capacity and not developing projects. So there's some really early interventions that they can do to try and free up that capacity, but it is an enduring issue. And frankly, the energy system needs huge amounts of upgrade in order to further electrify our economy.
Yeah, and it's a huge challenge with you know, a grid that's already up to capacity, and with increased electrification, there is a massive challenge there in terms of timescale. Just one question, and anyone on the panel can answer this. We've talked about the major challenge, these big projects, and the track 2 cluster sequencing process. There's a question here on how can you speed up the pace when most of the government reports mention a low regret approach, which is a risk averse and could justify the slow pace. How do we need to scale up the pace? Who wants to come in? John?
Yeah, let me start with that one. So we are deploying modular technology now. So I think the need for big projects is clearly there. The change needed is a large one. However, those projects will take years and years to come to fruition. We don't need to wait years and years. So we're putting units in. We have 9 going in this year, and we only started building our first one last year. These can be done very, very quickly. And the impact of one unit might be relatively small, but hundreds and hundreds have a really very large impact. So again, I think if we just rely on massive projects, we're looking in the wrong place. I think we need they are very important, absolutely, but I think the pace of change will be speeded up when we're a bit more creative about not just relying on the very, very big things to happen.
And I suppose, why do you believe it's so important to focus on the utilisation of carbon, and what kind of industries would benefit from this? We've talked about the projects in the industrial areas that are going to join to the infrastructure of the pipes and the stores, but what can utilisation offer to those dispersed sites and those sites that may not be able to?
I think it's really important for two reasons. One, the business case makes sense when you have a value for the carbon at the end. So often you talk to a sustainability manager who loves the idea, goes to their FD or their CEO, who looks at the return and says, we might do it next year. If they look at the carbon benefit and the return and go, right, that this payback is attractive, this is interesting, the change just happens more quickly. The second reason it's important is it genuinely makes products better. So if you're making a battery cell, if you want to build a gigafactory for batteries in the UK, you need a lot of graphite. China, which makes over 90% of the world's graphite, has stopped exporting it. Graphene, which is the way that we make our carbon, can be used to make even better batteries and to replace the need for graphite. So again, not just the business case makes sense, but it makes the products better. It acts to have a secondary carbon benefit. You're not just capturing it, you're then putting it in products which has a knock-on plus as well. So I think a combination of those factors, it allows change to happen quickly, business cases make sense, and to your point, if you're a customer who is geographically dispersed, so you're not linked to the Humber region, for example, you can't build a huge pipe to get to that cluster. You might locate there in the first place, but if you're in the middle of nowhere, so a water company site or a farm, for example, both of whom we work with in the UK, you need your own carbon capture on site that's going to work, and that's where tech like ours can really help.
And what sort of market levers do you need to be put in place to drive those types of products and the need for those sort of products?
So we're not reliant on government subsidy. What would help is clarity on carbon price long term. That's the biggest part of if you think about using our tech, there's a revenue stack. Graphene has a value, hydrogen has a value. The biggest unknown is what is the carbon value. So I think a regime which clarifies that and clearly puts that carbon price higher would help us. But the main message to your question is we are not reliant on government intervention or a subsidy. The business case often works without that.
Yeah, and I think the CCSA has done some work in terms of the enduring market and coming off subsidy, and obviously a carbon price, a high enough carbon price is absolutely integral to that. Richard, you wanted to come in?
I completely agree with everything that's just been said. Irrespective of the size of the project, the carbon price underpins everything that we're doing. You asked about interventions that government can do, and the reason that it has been so slow is because we have fiscal security held by Treasury who want to make sure that they're getting good value for money. So when major projects are relying on a subsidy, you need to be able to appeal to a ever-reducing pot of funding that's available. So building on the comments though, from a negative emission technology perspective, getting negative emissions into the ETS, legislating for voluntary carbon market, all these interventions can help take the burden off the taxpayer and allow industry to contribute its fair share to reaching net zero. And on the voluntary carbon market one in particular, that's really close to us because we're developing a number of projects that will function under that model in the US. We've agreed a number of agreements with major corporates that's putting the price of carbon dioxide captured and stored through BECCS at around about $350 per tonne. This is, serious intervention that we can have in the UK if we legislate for it.
Yeah. There is a question here that I'll bring in now here from Rob. As you've mentioned the US, he said, is there a possibility that funding could be retracted for the 33 large pilot projects announced recently in the US after the election result? So just in terms of that long-term certainty.
That we have a hard enough time forecasting what our own government does, never mind what happens over the pond. Yeah, it's a challenging question.
It is. Yep. And I think this is why this is why we we need to look to the carbon markets. We need to have self-sustaining business models that we're looking forward to, and one of those is around enabling the cross-border and maximising the geological potential that we have. There's a question here probably for you, Jonathan, in terms of what comparative advantage does the UK have, or are we looking at nearshoring? And I think if you could answer that both in terms of storage, but also in terms of the whole market and how quickly we need to move.
So, yeah, I mean, I wanted to actually make this point in relation to the last question: is what's needed. The simple answer is a bit of ambition, and actually also turning around some of the objectives that we've set ourselves are for the UK. They're not companies that have said, listen, this serves my particular company, we need to do this. So really the momentum that we need to sustain comes from both sides, and we absolutely need to make sure that essentially we're adding up to the numbers that we know we need to. We've set ourselves as a nation. But in terms of the opportunity, so the UK government, again, themselves identified this number of 78 billion in terms of the UK storage potential. 78 billion tonnes. And currently we don't put a single tonne into the ground. And we're hoping Track 1 probably adds up to about maybe 6 million tonnes, something like that. 78 billion. So we have this massive storage potential out there that when you consider other countries, I think, Olivia, you mentioned the cross-border work that's being done, has huge advantage for the UK. Because if Northern Europe, which has less alternatives in terms of how they decarbonise, will look to countries like the UK. And so we need to develop this industry to be ready for that. And then to the second part of your question, Olivia, how do we actually maximise the potential we have from an infrastructure and from an emitter standpoint? Well, again, it's back to the learning a new industry. It's technologies that we've been comfortable with in other parts of our industrial sector, but it's putting it all together. There's a lot of know-how that needs to be developed. It's all about skills, training, about young people that are actually going to learn these skills. So that takes decades. And we need to get on that pathway rather than be in this sort of, again, accelerating into this massive pause right now.
Yeah, John.
Just to add to that point about ambition, I completely agree with Jonathan. We've really gone international in the last 12 months, and there are regions of the world, the UAE being the best example, who are actively trying to lead on this technology. And they're doing that because they know if they get the first few projects, if they get the expertise, the next wave of these they will be at the forefront of. So we've created over 100 jobs in the UK in the last 2 years. That number's going to grow, but the UK will be, I think, left behind as other regions actively deploy this tech first, because they know when they've done that, that will then be exported to other countries. So I think there's a risk, honestly, that the UK and the lack of ambition and the lack of kind of tangible action means that we fall behind from what has historically been a really strong leadership position over the last 10 years.
Thank you. And I think there is a global race here, and we do need to move quickly so that we can both, secure storage of our domestic emissions, but also EU emissions before long-term contracts are signed elsewhere, but also, as you say, sort of develop the skills and the technology that we can then export elsewhere. Just in the last 2 minutes, I want to come to each of you, and I'll start with you, Kirstie, but just if you can sum up one or two of the key actions that you need either government or the industry to take for us to be able to meet the 2030 target.
Okay, so for me it would be more meaningful, purposeful interaction with young people, so they can see really clearly where they are right now, the skills, where they can access those skills, and what that leads them to.
Thank you, Richard.
It's about clarity, Olivia, getting a clear roadmap from the government as to what deployment looks like. But I really like the comment earlier around collaboration, not competition. That was actually a theme that ended up being picked up 12 months ago at this event, and I think it's incumbent upon us in industry to look at ways that we can work better together to set out credible pathways to meet net zero that government can support, rather than us looking to government to give us the answer.
Thank you. John?
I think the most important party here is industry. We're in the industrial breakout area here. I think industry acting and innovating is more important than government. The role government can play for us is the clarity on the carbon price.
And Jonathan?
I would say we've set our ambitions for 2030 and 2050. We should be, super clear on making sure that we're going to meet them. Right now, we're not.
Thank you. And I think from my point of view, I think I'd echo those points. It is a clear roadmap with a carbon price trajectory that means the industry can go there. We will have a general election at some point this year, and if there is a change in government, we absolutely have to have as limited a pause as possible, so that we can keep accelerating as an industry, and for whoever is in government to keep along the roadmap that is already set out, and the ambitions set out, and put everything in place to enable industry to get there. Thank you very much for your questions. I think this is the first session that any of us have probably ever done in headphones and mics, so thank you very much. I hope it was useful for you, and thank you very much to all the panellists. Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia. Thank you.